The following program is available in high definition on Channel 700. This program is designed and produced by the community with the support of TV Cogeco.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Our Home with Mayor Sendzik. I'm Walter Sendzik, Mayor of the City of St. Catharines, and I'm glad you're able to join us today. We've got an exciting lineup of guests that will be talking about a significant project here in our community. And we have first Grant LaFleche, who is well known to those who are familiar with the St. Catharines Standard, Niagara Falls Review, and the Welland Tribune. An investigative reporter who has covered a number of significant events that have taken place in our community. He is arguably one of the best reporters that we have here in Niagara, and he has received a number of national recognition awards for his investigative piece. As well, with Grant, we have Kathleen Powell, who is with the St. Catharines Museum. She's the head curator, and she is a part of a project that we're working on. It's the Welland Canal Fallen Workers Project. This project is a long time coming, and for those who are familiar and readers of the Standard, you'll know that they've been covering the development of this project for a number of years. And it's a project that, once completed, will give recognition, long overdue recognition, to those who built one of the most significant transportation infrastructure pieces, not just in Niagara, but in Canada. The Welland Canal, which those of you in our community are more than familiar with, that really goes through so many communities, but connects the Great Lakes of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario together, and allowing the shipping industry to access the Great Lakes and then access into the Atlantic Ocean. And it's such an important corridor for us. It's for those who get stuck at the bridge and you find your time able to contemplate, you see the big ships that go through. The last Welland Canal was built in the 1930s, I think is when it was opened. And so that's how long ago that significant engineering feat was constructed. So today we're going to be talking about what led to the development of the Welland Canal Fallen Workers Project. And we're going to start with Grant. And Grant, you've been involved since the beginning.
Yes.
And it wasn't by happenstance, it's just what happened.
So there's a local historian who you know well, and Kathy knows well, by the name of Arden Fair. Used to be the curator at the museum before you stepped in. And he'd been trying for years to get the Standard to write something about these men who had died building the ship canal. And just the way things go in newspapers, it just kept getting shuffled to the bottom of the deck as more pressing news of the day happened. But finally, he contacted me directly, and I said, okay, because he's very persistent, as Kathy knows. And so I finally met with Arden. We sat down at a Starbucks, and he brought in a file. I sometimes joke and say it's like the original draft of War and Peace. It's this giant stack of documents, and I just sort of rolled my eyes and thought, what am I going to do with this? But he walked me through kind of the basics of the story, that this canal was this is the third canal, right? The fourth one that's now there. And it was this huge public infrastructure project. And at the time, it was something like, they knew about 112 people had died, men had died building it. And in 32, when it opened?
Yep.
She's basically our encyclopedia. They just keep turning to Kathy. Are the dates right? In 32, when it opened, the then minister who was responsible for ships, and what was his actual title?
He was Minister of Railways and Canals.
Railways and Canals, and he promised a sort of a peacetime memorial for these guys. And it had a little bit of steam for a time, and then it just faded away. It just fell off the political agenda, and nobody heard from it again. And so Arden had brought to me a bunch of work that some local historians had done that identified these 112 men who died, and said, would I be interested in doing a couple of stories? So I put a pitch together, brought it to my editor, at the time was Wendy Metcalf, who's now at the Toronto Star. And she loved the idea, and so we went gangbusters, because at the time when we published the list, it was the first time that comprehensive list had ever been published for the public anywhere. And the interesting bit is in telling that initial story, and we found a couple of interesting tales of mostly immigrants who were coming over here and dying pretty awful deaths on the workplace. We put a petition together online just to see if there was any community interest, if the community would get behind it. Thousands of people ended up signing the thing, but what was really interesting from, I guess, a researcher's point of view is that the way the petition was set up, you could sign your name, Walter Sendzik, St. Catharines, and then there was a little space for a comment. And time after time, people were saying, well, my great-great-grandfather, or my great-uncle or something, he also died on the canal. And so I started shuffling these names over to Arden. And the more we started looking into it, the more we began to find more and more people. And the total now is what,
137?
137 that we know for sure died on the Welland Canal Memorial. And I probably wrote, I would say, a dozen or more stories just on the individual tales of these men who died. Some as young as 14. There was one young boy who got knocked off the thing and died in the rocks when he fell. So it just sort of took off from there. And the pressure built and built and built. We actually did a presentation to council, City Council in St. Catharines at that time. And your predecessor picked it up, former Mayor Brian McMullen, and then it just snowballed from there.
And it's interesting. So at which point in as a writer did you look and go, we've got something big here? Because you did get recognized nationally for
we got a national newspaper award nomination for it almost from the outset. That I thought that at the very least this might have some legs to it. The response to our initial couple of stories, including publishing that list, was tremendous, and I think people have a real appetite to know where they came from, where the community had come from. Something like the Welland Canal, as you said in your opening, is this tremendously important feature for the country. It's maybe the defining feature of Niagara outside of Niagara Falls. And people really took it to heart, I think, very, very quickly. And so the more we began to tell the stories of these men, so they weren't just numbers, which was kind of my real thrust, was to be able to say, look, if this is a guy who could have been your neighbor. Right. This is the guy who goes to GM every day, or he's somebody who goes and works at Port Weller. It's just that there were no safety standards and there were virtually no labor laws in those days. And some of the tales are really heartbreaking. Mm-hmm. There's one where it's a father, there's more than one where father and son die on the job. There's sometimes a whole generation of men, grandfather, father, son, killed. A lot of widows left behind. So, I mean, these were stories that people could identify with as human stories. So within a few days, it was pretty obvious that this had, at very least, community legs. Right. And then when Brian McMullen decided to say, well, maybe there's something we can do, and then almost overnight, there was just sweeping political legs behind it. I've rarely seen in Niagara the political community get behind something so fast and make it work that quickly.
And I think you're correct. It's you gave a human dimension to the numbers, and you put a face on the names. And so, Kathleen, you played a very important role in gathering that information. Tell us a bit about some of the men. Put more of a context around some of the men that were involved.
I think that the interesting thing, like Grant mentioned, is that these can be anybody. The whole cross-section of the workers, they really represent all people. There's young, like teenagers, 14 years old is the youngest. There are people closer to retirement, men in their 60s, and then everyone in between. Some were married, some were single, fathers and sons, war veterans, people who had come here to find a better life. When the canal was built, just before the First World War started, the world was in a bit of a depression, and so there were a lot of people traveling around looking for work and looking for a better life, and people immigrated here from Italy, Austria, Croatia, England, Scotland, Ireland, Sweden, all kinds of different places to find a better life, come to St. Catharines on this great project that's hiring hundreds and hundreds of men, and then sadly don't make it very far.
So in context, though, what were they getting paid?
The pay rate was pretty low,
That's okay.
I would say. I think it was just a couple of dollars a week.
But it was steady work.
It was
at
steady
a time
work.
in which there wasn't.
Yeah.
Right, and I think that's the important thing, because Grant touched on the safety of the workplace, or the lack of safety in the workplace, and through your research, you were able to see that they were doing hard work. This wasn't with machines. There was very
for sure.
little machines. There was no machines involved. So
Well, they had
talk about the work environment.
The work sites seem so crazy. They're really chaotic. When you look at them, you can't even believe it's actually a work site. To me, it just looks like a pile of junk all over the place. But anyway, the work sites are crazy. And there's a construction railway that's built, and so there's trains running through. There's guys building track at the same time. And then they've got pile drivers, early versions of such. They have different types of digging machines. They're building forms to pour concrete. There's a stone crushing plant. And like you say, most of these places, there's very little in the way of workplace safety put in place intentionally for these guys. So it's the same accident happening over and over again.
Look at the accidents. They're always crushed by tree, crushed by falling
Hit by a
rock,
dump car.
hit by a dump car, falling off the canal into the water. They're all bad. Like, not that when you die anywhere it's probably good,
Right.
but every time you look at the list, you end up cringing because every one is like just a bad way to go.
The
It was
crazy
hard,
thing
it
is,
was dangerous work.
I think the first 10 fatalities were all related to dump car accidents, and yet they didn't put any safety precautions in place, and so it's still happening right till the end, dump car accidents.
Well, and I think it's important because when you mentioned, Grant, about workplace safety, one of the elements of the Fallen Workers Memorial, the Welland Canal Fallen Workers Memorial, is the connection to safety in the workplace, and how this is a reminder of what it was like to be a worker in the past. And so did that play a role in the sort of public sentiment about recognizing these folks?
Yeah, I think so. I think if you put that workplace into the context of our 21st century environment, just one of those deaths would be a huge scandal. And there would be inquiries, and the government would get involved, and the Ministry of Labor would get involved. There's a minor workplace injury, and that happens now. And it was also to show people, and I think this is why people really took the project to heart, was they realized that this critical economic driver in our community, it has been that way, since the 1930s, people had to pay the ultimate price to build it.
Right.
There were men who survived the trenches of World War I, who came back to Canada, just wanted to make a living to put food on the table for their family, and a tree falls on them, or they get hit by one of these rail cars and they're dead.
Right.
And so the canal was built with sweat and literally blood, and I think people understood that pretty quickly.
Well, and I think that's what you've brought to this project is you've humanized it, you've brought it to a wider audience, you've given the men a history and a face, and you've acknowledged their hard work. And so I think on behalf of the community and on behalf of the city, I want to thank you for the work that you've done and seeing this project from the beginning through to what will be the completion of the project. That'll be a moment for us to acknowledge the work, but also celebrate the hard work of those before us. And it started with you and Arden. So on behalf of the community, I want to thank you.
Well, thank you.
What I want to do is we're going to go to a break, and after the break, we're going to have Greg Wight, who is the campaign chair, to raise the funds for this project, along with Kathleen, to continue to talk about the project and its evolution. Hello and welcome back to Our Home with Mayor Sendzik. Today we are talking about the Welland Canal Fallen Workers Memorial Project that has been underway for a couple of years now, but is really starting to gain momentum. And as you heard before the break, we had Grant LaFleche, who was one of the reporters for the St. Catharines Standard, that broke the story and put it back into the public space for the public to get involved and to really move the project along since the opening of the fourth Welland Canal back in 1932. And so we have Kathleen Powell, who is, again, from the St. Catharines Museum, arguably one of the best museums, not just in St. Catharines, Niagara, but across what I would say Ontario. So when you Joining Kathleen, we have Greg Wight, who is the Fundraising Chair for the task force. And Greg, thank you for joining us. Greg is the former President and CEO of Algoma Central Corporation. Algoma, those in the community know, Algoma Central has been in our community for a long time. They're the largest ship owner of the fleet in the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Seaway. Greg was the CEO, and he helped build that company into what it is today. He was involved with more than 30 years, I believe. With
35.
35 years with Algoma. And following his retirement, Greg got a phone call. And the phone call was, we're looking for someone to help lead the campaign side of the fundraising for this significant project. And Greg, I want to say thank you for taking on that leadership role. And just touch on why you thought it was important to you as someone involved in the industry and someone from St. Catharines.
Well, being with Algoma for 35 years, Algoma's business was predicated a lot on the Welland Canal, either moving grain for export through the Welland Canal to the St. Lawrence River, or moving coal or iron ore for Dofasco and Hamilton. It was very important. So for me, it was a natural that I would step up and help out. And Walter, you're wrong. You actually bought me lunch, so
Wasn't just a
you
phone call?
sealed the deal with that lunch. But, no, I was really pleased to be asked, and I'm pleased to be involved.
And it's been going very well, better than expected in some, because I think from the task force, which was struck in 2013, to get to where we are today, there was many who didn't think that there would be this outpouring of support. So when you got involved and started making phone calls to your industry peers, what were they saying?
Well, for the most part, they were saying yes. I mean, that's been the terrific thing, is there's been great support from the industry, both locally and across the country, and from the labor community. The labor community has been terrific. Just a couple for examples locally. My first phone call obviously was to Algoma, and they stepped up as the first major supporter. Tom Rankin from Rankin Construction was close behind. The St. Lawrence Seaway are there, and three labor organizations. Unifor, who represent the Seaway workers, the SIU, who represent the sailors working on the Great Lakes vessels, and the Niagara District Labor Council, or Regional Labor Council, have all stepped up as major supporters. So there's a great balance between industry and labor. And other shipping companies, Canada Steamship Lines, FedNav, and Groupe de Gagné from Quebec. And we've had terrific support from the Hamilton area with ArcelorMittal Dofasco, a major user. McKeel Marine and Heddle Marine have all stepped up. And one last one locally was the Ontario Paper Thorold Foundation, who were users of the canal for a long time and had a historical connection, and they stepped up. So great support.
I know you were at a lunch for the Marine Chamber of Commerce in Toronto, and you did a brief presentation. What was the reception in that room for what we'll be showing soon in terms of the memorial itself? But what was that reception like?
The reception was terrific, and there was a couple hundred individuals from the marine industry. I mean, it brought it home to me when one of the companies, I won't say which one, had already declined my request to be involved, and the owner came up to me after the luncheon and said, "I'm in as a major supporter, $25,000." So that was worth the trip to Toronto.
And so from a room like that and from the calls, what was the target? What was the target that was set by the task force in terms of what's the goal we're trying to reach to make this project a reality?
The goal is $750,000, and that includes the design, the construction of the memorial and the installation and the surrounding parquet.
Right, right. And so from what you've been able to accomplish today, which is amazing, is bring the labor involved, get the companies that have been involved in the Welland Canal in one form or another, and then we'll have a public campaign where we'll be able to go and ask members of the community who are looking to support this, and that'll make the amount, that the target of 750.
Yeah, and there's the government stream as well. So
Right.
So we've our seed money was $150,000 from Heritage Canada,
Heritage Canada.
which was a great start, and we plan to go to the region at some point for some support. And the fourth area is the community campaign, which we really haven't started yet. We wanted to get the corporate campaign well underway and go to the community as the final push to get over the line, which I'm very confident that we'll get there.
And I do have to acknowledge, because the kickstart was the federal application and funding, and that came from Rick Dykstra, former MP for the city of St. Catharines. He really led that charge in Ottawa to get the funding that helped kickstart this, and then with Brian McMullen formed the task force and got it to a point in which we now have a design in place. So Kathleen, Derek Revington was in the community for, I believe, early February. He was going to Port Colborne and he was in Thorold. We were looking at the design. Can you speak to the design?
Yeah, I sure can, if they're going to be showing up the pictures.
Yeah, we'll be having them on the screen here, and you'll be able to take us through a bit of it.
So the design is located at the one end of the area where the St. Catharines Museum is located, right along the Welland Canal's Parkway, right at the very bottom end of Lock 3 on the Lock 2 end of it, basically, if you're navigating in that direction. And so what we're looking at now is if you would be looking towards the Homer Bridge on the Welland Canal. So you can see that when you approach, there's a couple of different components to the design, which includes the interpretation, a bit of an interpretive panel that tells you a bit of information about what you're going to see. And then the thing that's the most striking is this large piece of metal that's here. That's on one side it's black, and in this design image it shows there's a quote on it that represents a little bit about the project and the workers, and then on the other side it's actually polished stainless steel, and it's kind of a veil that once you go past it, you will be into this kind of contemplative area that makes you think about your place with regard to the Welland Canal and with regard to the workers who died on the Welland Canal.
So the image that you're seeing there will be seen from what would be the Welland Canal Parkway. Yep. And there's a cut into the land, into this parquet area. There's a cut in, and it's bookend by two different elements of the design.
That's right. So on the right-hand side is the veil, and then on the left-hand side are the gates of remembrance, and they kind of take the same rough idea as the gates of one of the locks, and on the gates of remembrance are the names of all of the fallen workers.
So this is the top view,
yep.
And the top view gives you what it'll look like in terms of how it's being designed from the veil, from the gates to the veil.
Yep.
And surrounded by trees, that'll give you a bit of comfort. And then here's, if you want to explain this one, that's where the gates are.
That's right. So on the far right-hand side is the gates of remembrance, and then you can see that there's a worker that's looking into this polished steel, and he can see back reflected on him the gates of remembrance as well as the rest of the parquet, and then he probably can see a bit of this. You saw it in the overhead view, but this sunken area has a bit of a timeline on it that represents, each one of those lines represents the number of workers that died in a specific year. So it kind of takes you on all kinds of different journeys of dimensions of the workers, what they were up against, how they might have died, and trying to connect it to yourself, essentially. And
so this image here, and so that's the timeline you were talking about, yep. And just gives you the outline of from 1913 to 1933, and you see in 1927 a significant amount had died in that period of time.
Yeah, in 1928 was the largest number of deaths, and part of it is because of a humongous accident at Lock 6 where the gate, when they were raising the gate to attach it to the wall, essentially, one of the cranes collapsed, fell in, took out the other gate that was there, and 10 men died in that accident. Although it still was a pretty significant year for accidents because there were 19 other deaths on top of that. And it was a big year for construction. There was a lot going on, a lot of guys in small amounts of space, and really it was tragic.
So as you can see by the design, it's substantive. And when you think about public work, public artwork in our community, this will arguably be the most significant.
I would think so, yeah.
And in Niagara, when you look at these type of installations, it's actually designed in a way that it will be a destination, an attraction for a lot of people. And so how do people get more information on it, make a donation? Where do they go?
Well, they can always check out the website. It's on the City of St. Catharines website, www.stcatharines.ca. But in addition to that, they can come to the museum. We have information in our tourist information there that has information about the monument, but also they can call the city. Really the best spot is probably to start at the website. All the contact information is there. They can call to make a donation. They could come in and make a donation. They can even go to City Hall and make a donation.
Okay, before we wrap up, it's scheduled to be completed.
2017?
2017 when? What's the target date?
I think the target date is the end of the summer, early fall, somewhere
Okay.
around there.
And that is going to be a special celebration as we celebrate our 150th birthday as a country. This will be a wonderful way to tie that in because of how important this infrastructure project was to the economy of Canada, and recognizing the workers that had died during that construction will be a fitting way to remember them and to celebrate our country and all the significant projects that have come to define us. And this was a significant project. So I want to thank you, Greg, for the work that you've provided on this project and continue to provide. Kathleen, for the work that you're doing on the research component of it, and for joining us here today. And we look forward to the public joining us in September, or in 2017, for the opening of the Fallen Workers Memorial for the Welland Canal. And until then, follow on the website, stcatharines.ca. Continue to follow it in the Standard. There's going to be a number of stories covering the workers. And until next time, look forward and have a great, great day.
Just talk, nobody move, everybody